Brace yourself.
Video game music is probably one of the most underrated elements of modern video games. For one reason or another, the music that shapes the audio landscapes of our favorite games these days just doesn't possess the widespread recognition that film scores or classic albums do. Perhaps it's the youth of the gaming medium, but we as gamers already know the kind of legendary themes that have shaped our gaming experiences. Whether it's the eerie ambiance of Donkey Kong Country's Life in the Mines, or the adrenaline-drenched metal of Metal Gear Rising's Rules of Nature, to the soaring symphonies of a Colossus Climb in Shadow of the Colossus, we gamers have already documented the legendary music of video games. Still, when it comes to games, this music acts more as a cosmetic complement than something integrally tied with the game design itself. Mechanically, music isn't utilized in the most essential way, even in the crowded rhythm game genre. I'm a big fan of rhythm games, specifically Japanese rhythm games like Project Diva, or indie games that let me use my own music, like AudioSurf. Still, while rhythm games do have a stronger connection to the gameplay, it's more pressing buttons at the right time, instead of integrating the musical construction into the game design itself. It's not easy to innovate music in games from a mechanical standpoint, but I think there is an example of this, one that sort of disappeared from the public radar after its launch: sound shapes on the PlayStation Network. Sound Shapes was developed by Queasy Games and Sony Santa Monica. Released in 2012 for the PlayStation 3 and Vita, Sound Shapes marked Sony's continued foray into cultivating the promising indie studios with the publicity of the PlayStation Network. It earned numerous positive reviews and awards upon release, but has since fallen into obscurity, even after a 2013 release on the PlayStation 4. Sound Shapes continued Sony's Play, Create, Share marketing direction, encouraging user-generated content for games like Little Big Planet, Mod Nation Racers, and Infamous 2. Sound Shapes remains one of the most ambitious games I've seen when it comes to music. So here's today's thesis. Sound Shapes innovates the use of music in games by focusing on game utility, building the levels around the musical themes instead of simply using it as a complementary aesthetic in the presentation. Sound Shapes is, at heart, a platformer. You control your little blob character around various stages with the main goal of reaching the record player at the end. With the ability to roll, jump, and stick to certain surfaces, many of the mechanics of Sound Shapes are pretty grounded. While there are the occasional power-up that change up navigation a bit, most of your abilities are introduced early and don't change much over the course of the campaign. You're stuck with a collection of simplistic techniques for levels on end, so it's up to the game's level design to keep you engaged on a gameplay level. Sound Shapes' praise mostly centered on its creative direction when it came to audio in a game. Each track that played during each level was dynamic, changing and adding more layers of sound as the player collected the various note pickups throughout the stage. While a stage began with a flat metronomic beat, the player can add new percussion, melodies, and effects by obtaining more and more of the stage's note pickups. The music grows in complexity as the player takes on the challenges of finding every note, which demonstrate an excellent sense of progression even in the simplest of stages. In retrospect, Sound Shapes does a fantastic deconstruction of video game music, and, in a way, shows the different individual pieces that culminate into the memorable themes and tracks we love. Now, due to various YouTube regulations regarding game audio, I can't play any large portions of music from the main campaign. This is because the soundtrack contains a collection of tunes from independent artists like Island's Jim Guthrie and Shawhan Liam of I Am Robot and Proud, in addition to more popular acts like Deadmau5. It bums me out that this audio can't be demonstrated in its purest form, because some of the best examples of level design in Sound Shapes come from The Last World, which features moody croons from Quirkmaster Beck. However, I want to show the various progression that the audio takes in Sound Shapes, so I took a look at a community level that I feel makes some strong examples of giving the player a continuous sense of progression and construction as they navigate the stage and collect the notes. I'll take a look at Progressive Extended by Progressive CX. Firstly, only ambient audio plays at the beginning, only gaining a theme once the immediate notes are collected. Afterward, rattly percussion and snares begin to play. Collecting more notes on the first screen builds upon the music with warped electronic beats. As you can likely hear, some beats are overlay atop one another for different musical volumes and timbres. By the time I reach the third or fourth screen, the music is already layered, all without reaching cacophonous levels. Also, depending on the types of notes I collect, this determines what variety of sound is produced. Sometimes this is a snare beat, sometimes this is an electronic blip. Further screens create additional melodies and some hooky rhythms atop the initial beats produced. As I reach the later screens, the song changes entirely, dropping the collected sounds from the notes and resetting the tone. The density of the music is able to immediately be pulled back, while the player is compelled to recalculate the amount of sound that their exploring of the screens has developed. I found this particular direction to be a kind of second act, letting the player re-gauge their own progress without having to start the entire level all over again. It's a nice gesture that lets the player indulge in their accomplishment a bit. By the end of the stage, the once pulled back track is rebuilt up by the player's collectibles as the player moves toward the finish line and the stage is completed. As the counter displays the amount of notes collected, the player is given an ending statistic to show how diligently they grabbed the note pickups. While these pickups weren't necessary to completion, the game does encourage the player to go for them. Similarly, the way the music pulled back in the second act likely wouldn't have as big an impact for the player if the music they had composed leading up to it wasn't as dense from fewer collectibles. This level was a great example of giving the player incentive to gather more and more layers for the music to build upon, but also acting in a gratifying way for the player, offering a small peek into their progress without ending the level prematurely. In capturing footage, I also took a peek into the level editor of sound shapes, which, like many level editors in video games, is a bit complicated. Putting a level editor in your game is tricky in that while it's great to offer players the longevity of continuous user-generated content, the editor interfaces are usually too deep and intimidating to provide a high level of user-friendliness. They're tricky to get a handle on, and they demand a high level of planning and ingenuity to produce really good results. Admittedly, I tried making a short dummy level and it wasn't that good. I mostly relied on the talented, diligent members of the community to provide the real creativity. And despite the game's age and waning popularity, the number of user-made levels still had that spark to show. But the level editor also shows a few other gameplay facets that are worth mentioning. Building a level in sound shapes isn't so much building a level. This is because of the musical elements of the game and how these elements are inherently linked with the levels themselves. The music measure layout begins on the left side of the screen and moves toward the right. Notes change in pitch depending on where they are placed in the stage. A note will play a higher pitch the higher it's placed on the screen, and the opposite for lower pitch notes. Because of this, making a good, melodic, and rhythmically sensible song usually takes priority when designing a stage. SoundShape's level editor is a music editor first, and game editor second. Most of the time, notes must be set in places on the screen that would be normally difficult to reach under typical platform mechanics like in Mario. SoundShapes demands unorthodox level design in its editing, levels rich with verticality and movement in direction other than do right. This is likely why the ability to stick to surfaces was introduced, in order to compensate for the demand to make stretches toward the top and left directions instead of simply the right and occasionally downward. SoundShapes does a great job of compensating for its musical focus by introducing level properties that are much more flexible from other platformers, serving to tear down the barriers that would otherwise restrict the platforming challenges. There's versatility in the editor, which is important to know, because it likely is the reason why there's versatility in the levels themselves. Soundshapes reimagines many of the musical elements we've come to expect from video games, and uses them in a way that focuses more on construction utility than aesthetic complementation. While there is a degree of style to the music's purpose, it's more to give the developers, and the players, opportunities to craft music through level design. Giving the player the skills needed to explore these unusually designed stages, like the adhesion to certain objects, Queasy offer the necessary freedom required to let music be built amongst the game's rules. I still believe it's difficult to really change how music can be used in the video game medium. Some of my favorite music in games is used to capture a moment or produce an emotion that complements what the player is doing. But without that music, the game is still functional. Sure, it might be lessened by the lack of music, but from a mechanical standpoint, things remain unchanged. Soundshapes wouldn't be able to do what it wants without its music. It's a core element that would demolish the design framework entirely were it to not be present. Soundshapes look simple, but in a world where music is often used aesthetically instead of mechanically, it stands out enormously. Soundshapes is not a rhythm game. This is a music game.